In this lecture, we'll be looking at Chapter 7, Toward Utopia, Moral Reform in American Art in the 19th Century. Now, women's labor was a necessary part of the building of colonial America, and although the legal status of women in the colonies was limited, and men played the central economic one, women enjoyed rights and privileges denied them in Europe. Nevertheless, the cult of domesticity also established the American home as a refuge from the desecrations of the modern business world, a place where spiritual values could be cultivated, and a measure which to evaluate women's cultural productions. Large numbers of middle-class women in America were caught up in Christian reform movements that promoted the abolition of slavery, temperance, and universal suffrage. What came to be known as domestic feminism placed these social reform movements with an ideology of the home as a site of edification and enlightenment. Needlework and painting were considered appropriate handicrafts for women during the first half of the century, and women are all well represented among American folk artists. However, little formal training was available, and many women were self-taught. Numerous prominent women artists came from families whose reformist tendencies extended to a belief in wider opportunities for women. By mid-century, as educational reform led to greater openings for women, there was a divide between women who thought of themselves as amateurs and those who had begun to think of art as a profession. From the beginning, women's social organizing drew on skills included at home. Needlework and textile manufacture, tensions between a household activity expected of virtually all women and an income-producing occupation in the industrializing society was seen. Women's traditional skills as producers of cloth were transferred to industrial production. Female workers were also the first industrial workers in America following the wide-scale development of textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts around 1826. It began with the idealistic hope that the exploitation of women workers in England could be avoided in America. However, it failed. But what we do see is the founding of the Female Labor Reform Association in 1845, which led to the first government inquiry into labor conditions in the United States. Women used their skills in needlework to connect the domestic sphere and the public world of collective social action. Popular abolitionist slogans started to appear in works, and by 1834, women were selling needlework items to raise money for the cause. Pieced quilts also began to show reform thought. A pattern called the Underground Railroad contains a series of light and dark squares leading to the central areas identified with safe houses that sheltered escaping slaves on their route north. And it was women who often drew attention to the abolitionist cause. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel that came out in 1852, has been called the most important act by an individual to advance the cause of abolition. Drawing the obvious parallels between the condition of women and slaves, one quote is, "The plight of slave and woman blends like the colors of the rainbow," unquote. In the southern states, the skills and labor of slave women were also integral to the production of visual culture. The designs characterized by 19th century African American quilts, such as vertical stripes, strong colors and shapes, asymmetry, and multiple pattern, have roots through sometimes disguised in the forms and elements of African cosmology and mythology. And we have Harriet Powers, whose dates are 1837 to 1911, who was a woman born into slavery in Georgia. Within her quilts, there are three types of narratives: biblical tales, local legends, and astronomical occurrences. Narrative quilts like hers are a distinctly American art form. However, she and other slave quilters used applique techniques that have been traced to historic Eastern and Middle Eastern civilizations and which have roots in African tapestry traditions. Powers herself produced the detailed descriptions of each scene that enabled subsequent generations to decode its complex iconography. Other slaves were sometimes able to use their sewing skills to effect the transition to life as a free woman. For an example, if they could sell them, they could actually buy their freedom. The full impact of the women's movement began to be felt with the first U.S. National Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Now, geography and class played a significant role in shaping the experiences of 19th century American women artists. Many middle-class women in the major urban centers of the East remained tied to European models of cultural and intellectual life. However, the opening up of the West and life on the frontier dramatically changed the lives of other women during the second half of the century. Westward expansion had a massive effect on the native populations also. Visual culture and life were integrated in ways not easily assimilated to European models. Among Native Americans, visual objects were produced by many individuals of both sexes. And now this topic deserves a much more in-depth exploration, however, it's not our focus here. But it is interesting to see that the quilts made by settlers quickly began to reflect the patterns and colors of native weaving and basketry. Among Western settlers, the first generations of professional women sculptors were able to depend on family connections and on an emerging group of wealthy private collectors, philanthropists, many of them women. And we'll see more of this later on. The painter Lily Martin Spencer, as well as many of the women trained in the design professions, were part of the professionalizing education for those middle-class women forced to support themselves. And we're also seeing at the time the emergence of a new middle-class buying public also played a very important role in the dissemination of their works. So now we'll look at the painter Lily Martin Spencer. Her date's 1822 to 1902. And she's often seen as an exception among 19th century American artists. She was a married woman from Ohio who depended on her art to support her husband, and their 13 children. Her husband stayed at home and assisted in both professional and domestic duties. And she refused the opportunity to go to Europe for training. Her paintings belong to the period when American art shifted from an untutored folk expression to styles based on academic traditions and the study of European art. Her career is closely linked to the growing demand for inexpensive prints to decorate middle-class homes. And she became the most popular and widely reproduced female genre painter of mid-19th century America. However, the full nature and extent of her training is unknown. Her first major success came in 1849 with her painting Life's Happy Hour, when it was selected by the Western Art Union for engraving. Now, although often criticized for exploiting artists and vulgarizing public taste, the art unions were instrumental in developing the aesthetic tastes of the new buying public. In 1848, she moved her family to New York in order to obtain the additional training that would enable her to meet the growing demands for images of happy, self-sufficient domesticity. Her art has been characterized as neither an out-and-out affirmation of the middle class and patriarchal values, nor an explicit rejection of such values, but rather an uncertain response, an embrace of them, while also increasingly, yet perhaps unconsciously, a teasing or making subversion of them. The good-natured humor and clumsy drawing of her work belong to the American folk tradition of exaggerated humor and sentimental nostalgia. The founding of the Cosmopolitan Art Association in 1854 expanded her market through its periodical, its magazine, the Cosmopolitan Art Journal, which aimed at a female audience with the leisure and education to read magazines. Her work, Fee Fo Fum, exhibited at the National Academy of Design in 1858, was produced as the magazine's frontispiece, which is the illustrated facing the title page, the following year. The painting found a responsive audience among the journal's readers for this scene of family intimacy as a defense against threats from the outside world. And I tried to find this image and I cannot find it. The painting was widely produced, and its wide production spread Spencer's name across America. But despite her role in defining a popular imagery, she herself struggled financially through much of her life. And now this is going to bring us to the first generation of professional women artists who trained abroad during the 1850s and 1860s. Here, they were mainly female art students whose families were willing to support their aspirations, and we see them flocking to Europe for training. However, they were barred from art academies. They sought private instruction, often at a high cost. They entered art history bound together as what Henry James called them a, quote, strange sisterhood of American lady sculptors, unquote. However, what we've seen is much of art history has lumped them together, and by doing so has obscured the real differences that existed among them. They were encouraged to pursue individual lives and careers by liberal parents, other women involved in public reform activity, and by the fact that the neoclassical movement was understood as an extension of classical Greece when flourishing of the arts had accompanied political liberty. Sculpture was also associated with the elevated moral and spiritual values which legitimized female reform activity. The same moral arguments which legitimized some women's choices of sculpture as a profession, though, were frequently used by critics to contain their production within the boundaries of what was seen as acceptably feminine. An art critic argued that sculpture by women belonged in a domestic setting where it was destined to refine and embellish many a home. However, these sculptors succeeded more than any other women before them in integrating themselves into a male system of artistic production. Although their work includes numerous representations of women, they often chose to depict strong, active females, and they struggled to escape the devaluation that accompanied the identification of their work as feminine. The sisterhood was among the first group of American women to exchange marriage and domesticity for professional careers. In fact, all except Hoxie remained single. The idea was the woman artist must either neglect her profession or her family. And Hosmer said her profession became her family, and she constantly referred to her sculptures as her children. This reassured the Victorian middle class that although some women had turned their backs on marriage, they remained bound by codes of respectable femininity. The passionate nature of women's relationships with one another was also accepted because of a widely held belief that since genital sexuality was exclusively defined in relation to men, that women's love for one another could only be an extension of their pure and moral natures. The women neoclassical sculptors also produced a number of images of women responding with fortitude and moral courage to the changes of fate and the powerlessness expressed by women under patriarchy. And we'll see this in Ammonia Lewis's The Freedwoman and Her Child from 1866 and Homer's Zenobia in Chains from 1859. And so that's going to lead us to looking at our first female sculptor. And this is Harriet Hosmer. Her date's 1830 to 1908. And she was one of many of the neoclassical sculptors who followed Horatio Granat to Rome after 1825 in search of good marble and skilled carvers, historical collections of classical sculpture to study, and an inexpensive and welcoming environment. She was the first of the group of women sculptors to arrive in Rome in the 1850s and 60s. She was born in Watertown, Massachusetts, and was educated at a liberal school and decided early on to become a sculptor. She arranged to have private anatomy lessons from Dr. J.N. McDowell in St. Louis. And the Medical College of St. Louis was one of the few places that actually allowed women to study the human body. She adopted the persona of a playful tomboy rather than a grown woman to often be accepted in society. She is often coupled with William Wetmore Story as the leading American sculptors of their day. Almost all of her work was executed in her first decade in Rome. She carved her first full-length marble sculpture titled Hesper or the Evening Star in 1852 by herself in her Watertown studio. Now, the Boston actress Charlotte Cushman, who was actually the center image here, she encouraged her to go to Rome for further study, and she and her father sailed with Cushman in 1852. Now, Cushman is now primarily associated with women sculptors, but Hosmer was merely the first of a circle of artists, both men and women, who benefited from the actress's friendship and personal support. Cushman encouraged the sculptor John Gibson, who did not normally accept pupils, to instruct Hosmer. Hosmer's first public success came not from a full-size figure, but with what's called a fancy or a conceit artworks. These are smaller works. And this was a Puck on a Toadstool from 1856, and it's the image on the left here on the slide. Replicas of her work eventually earned her some $50,000 and ensured her fame. However, her decision to produce a purely commercial work was precipitated by her father's sudden financial losses and her need to be financially independent in order to remain in Rome. And then the image on the right is her Zenobia in chains from 1859. Now, the story of Zenobia, who was a 3rd century queen of Palmyra, who had been defeated and captured by the Romans, was well known. However, Hosmer's, is unique in its archaeological details. The draped figure is proportioned according to antique canons, and the features are based on an antique coin, and the garment and ornaments are based on a mosaic in San Marco in Florence, Italy. Now, departing from literary sources of the story, Hosmer presents a queen who does not succumb to defeat, who responds with fortitude to her capture and humiliation. She emphasizes her intellectual courage, fusing Christian ideals with a 19th century feminist belief in women's capability. The first exhibition of the work in England in 1862 brought a disappointing critical response, and Hosmer, like many women artists before her, was forced to respond to charges that her work was not her own. However, when it was exhibited in the United States the following year, it was a triumphant success, and it was a success as a testament to the 19th century moral ideals. More than one critic praised it as an embodiment of the new ideal of womanhood. The success of the work enabled Hosmer to establish herself in an impressive studio in Rome. Now later, her production gradually declined for reasons which are not clear. And that'll bring us to Louisa Lander. Her date's 1826 to 1923. She arrived in Rome in 1855, and she had previously modeled portrait busts in Washington, D.C. Her sculpture, Virginia Dare from 1860, who has as its subject Virginia Dare, who was the first white woman born in the New World. Virginia Dare was part of the Roanoke colony, and her fate is not known. However, Lander's unusual interpretations of the themes and the figure's erect stance and bold gaze are a departure from the usual neoclassical convention of displaying the female nude with their chin dropped and gaze lowered. And you can see the Virginia Dare sculpture here. A few other women artists. We have Emma Stephens, 1815 to 1882. She actually began as a painter, but became interested in sculpture after meeting Cushman in Rome in 1856. She worked on historical and religious subjects, and Cushman steadfastly supported Stephens' professional life. And again, we're seeing women artists continue to go to Rome well into the 1860s. We have Margaret Foley, whose dates are 1827 to 1877, who arrived in Rome about 1860. She had begun carving and modeling in Vermont, where she was born. She also taught Saturday art classes before going to Boston to become a cameo cutter and a sculptor. Her bronze sculpture, Stonewall Jackson, cast in London in 1873, was actually the first Confederate war monument in the United States. Then we have Florence Freeman, whose dates are 1836 to 1876, and she arrived in Rome in 1861, and she also studied with Richard Grenat. She specialized in bas reliefs and was closely connected to Cushman's circle. Now, it's the works of Anne Whitley and Ammonia Lewis which are most powerfully connected with the human rights issues of the day. Before going to Rome, both sculptors worked in Boston. So we'll first look at Anne Whitney. Her dates are 1821 to 1915, and she also came from a liberal Unitarian family in Watertown, Massachusetts. She was a poet before she became a sculptor, and a publication of her work in Una, which was the first women's right publication, in 1855 brought her to the attention of the leading feminists of the day. Her friendships with other women were crucial to her decision to pursue a career in sculpture. By 1863, she had executed her first full life-size sculpture, which was a Lady Godiva, and she did this in 1861. Her social concerns were strengthened through attendance at emancipation meetings and anti-slavery conditions. And you see in her Africa from 1863, which is pictured here, this was created in the same year as the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and portrays a symbolic mother of an African race rising from slavery. After arriving in Rome in 1866, she again took up themes of social and political importance. She returned to Boston in 1871 for a government commission of Samuel Adams for the Capitol in Washington, D.C. However, she lost a competition in 1875 for her statue of Charles Sumner when it was learned that the woman had won the competition. They took the win away. Later in her life, she taught at Wesley College in Massachusetts. And then that's going to bring us to Ammonia Lewis, 1854 to after 1909. Now, she's the only major American woman artist of color in the 19th century, and we have discussed her before in a previous chapter. She was part black, part Chippewa Indian, and part white. She was educated at Oberlin College in Ohio, and after 3 male sculptors refused to instruct her, she actually turned to Whitney for informal lessons. However, conscious to the extent to which the white community regarded her as an exotic and afraid that she would be accused of not having done her own work, she later refused additional training. And she arrived in Rome in 1866. And with Chapman and Cushman's professional support, she began a series of works on Black and American Indian themes. The Freed Woman on first hearing of her liberty from 1866 and Forever Free from 1867 both take up the subject of emancipation and both produce social statements in the experience of slavery using the aesthetic conventions of the neoclassicalism's idealized figures. Unfortunately, the Freed Woman on first hearing her liberty, the sculpture has actually been lost. On October 18, 1869, she returned to the United States for the dedication of Forever Free at the Tremont Temple in Boston. Here, she saw her work installed as a monument to freedom and self-determination. And then her later life, though, remains obscured by rumor and mystery. And then that's going to lead us to our last artist, which is Vinnie Ream Hoxie, whose dates are 1847 to 1914. She was born in Madison, Wisconsin in 1847, and she studied there briefly before moving to Washington, D.C. in 1862. Here she did receive some training while she was in Washington, D.C. Now, her figure of Abraham Lincoln was unveiled in Statuary Hall in the Capitol in 1871, and that's the sculpture you see here. However, the circumstances surrounding the commission sum up all the ambivalence expressed toward the first generation of professional American women. She had actually executed a portrait bust of Lincoln, and after she did that, she actually met him. She got to meet him in person. Yet, after her work on Lincoln was entered into the congressional competition, she was attacked for her youth and inexperience by several senators. Others, however, praised her beauty and charming demeanor. The criticism quickly deteriorated into attacks on female sculptors and the inappropriate behavior of women desiring to execute large monuments. However, the commission was finally awarded to her. Her moving depiction of the weary and bowed president was enthusiastically received, and the young sculptor became an instant celebrity. However, the New York Tribune attacked her technical abilities, describing her Lincoln as a frightful abortion and the artist as a fraud, and charged again that the sculpture was not her own work. The sexualized language of the critical attack reveals the unconscious belief that female ambition exceeded and violated nature. However, several prominent women came to her defense, including Hosmer. Hosmer said, quote, "We women artists will not hear that we are imposters without asking for proof. Hoxie is as much entitled to credit of her work as any artist I know. We resent all such accusations as unjust, ungenerous, and contemptible. Now, Hosmer's statement is a reflection for the increasing public confidence that Americans were displaying during the 1870s and the 1880s. By 1876, when the Centennial Exposition opened its doors in Philadelphia, women represented almost a fifth of the labor force, and their part in more than 600 different exhibits displayed their achievements in journalism, medicine, science, business, and social work, all reflect this growing public confidence. And what we'll see is during the second half of the century, women also contributed to defining what we'll call a new art. And we will cover that in a future lecture.